Why is America's worst serial killer almost entirely forgotten? And what does this crime spree tell us about law and order in the United States today? When we think of the most notorious serial killers, names like the Zodiac, Ted Bundy, and the Green River Killer often dominate the conversation. Yet, there is one who eclipses them all. Both the sheer volume of crimes he committed and the mystery surrounding his identity. The press dubbed him Billy the Axeman. Some researchers know him today as the man from the train. But regardless of his nickname, this shadowy figure almost certainly murdered more people than Bundy, Ridgway, and the Zodiac combined. And he was never caught. From the late 1890s to 1912, the most prolific serial killer in American history roamed the United States. Traveling by rail from Iowa to Oregon, he targeted entire families in rural towns, slaughtering them in the middle of the night with an axe, only to flee the crime scene by catching a passing train. So why was this murderer never caught? Well, because law enforcement didn't know he existed. While these brutal murders shocked rural towns across the West, the crimes were too sporadic and too spread out for anyone to piece together a pattern. It was only by the tail end of his killing spree that the press began to suspect a single culprit. By the time law enforcement had begun to piece together the similarities between each murder, the trail ran cold as Billy the Axeman vanished into history. Eventually, nearly every one of his crimes would be forgotten by the public, only to be rediscovered over a century later after multiple researchers pieced together newspaper reports of his crimes. This time, he was given a new nickname, the man from the train. But while we don't know the ultimate fate of America's worst serial killer, we do know one thing. If he committed his crimes today, he would almost certainly have been caught. Advances in forensics and better communication between law enforcement agencies have made it easier than ever before to catch murderers like the man from the train. And thanks to these technological advances, more and more serial killers are being caught than ever before. But while law enforcement has far more tools available today than we had over a century ago, the murder clearance rate is currently sitting near an all-time low. What's more, nonviolent criminals seem to be operating in near total impunity in many parts of the United States. Ultimately, the problem America faces today isn't the threat of another Billy the Axeman. Our country is instead having to deal with Billy the store robber, Billy the subway pusher, Billy the car smasher, and thousands of other petty criminals in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Part of the reason Billy the Axeman was so notorious a century ago was because crime itself was so rare at the time. If your small town woke up one day to realize that an entire family was slaughtered in their beds, it made front page news and everyone got together in order to do something about it. But here's a question. When was the last time a newspaper or media outlet reported that the murder rate in St. Louis and Baltimore was higher than any other country on earth? Today, we just sort of accept that in some parts of America, certain crimes will go unpunished, even if law enforcement has the technology and resources to identify the culprit. And that's because for all the tools that law enforcement has, they do not have the support of politicians and prosecutors who are responsible for holding certain criminals accountable. Instead, these groups increasingly seem to be taking the side of the criminals, sometimes even going out of their way to target honest civilians who step in and try to stop these acts from taking place. But it really doesn't have to be this way. Our problem isn't that we lack the technology or resources to prevent or solve many crimes. It's that there's a glaring lack of political will to punish criminals and uphold the law. And until governments get back to punishing criminals and protecting citizens rather than the other way around, this problem is only going to get worse. Do you have a why you would like us to answer? Go into the link in the description and pose your question, and maybe the next Why Minutes will be dedicated to you.